There is a photograph taken backstage at the Ed Sullivan Theater in 1963 that almost nobody has ever seen. Ed Sullivan is standing in the wings 30 seconds before he walks out to introduce the next act. The audience is already seated. The orchestra is already tuned. The cameras are already live. In 20 seconds, the most powerful man in American entertainment is going to walk out onto that stage and smile. And 40 million people watching in their living rooms are going to feel, as they felt every Sunday night, that the week has officially ended and something warm and familiar and safe has begun. In the photograph, he is not smiling. He is standing very still, with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the curtain, past the stage, past the audience, past all of it. He looks like a man who is preparing to do something that requires everything he has. Not a performance, not a television show. Something that requires the specific private courage of a person who has been doing a hard thing for so long that the hardness has become invisible to everyone except him. And then the stage manager gave the signal, and Ed Sullivan walked out, and 40 million people saw the smile, and the hardness disappeared, and nobody watching had any idea it had ever been there. Nobody watching knew about the drinking. Nobody watching knew about the rages that cleared rooms and ended friendships and left his staff shaking in corridors. Nobody watching knew about the marriage that had been held together for decades by a woman of extraordinary patience, whose name most of America never learned. Nobody watching knew about the depression that had sat at the center of his life since before the show began, since before the column, since before any of it, sitting there quietly in the middle of everything he built, never going away, never getting smaller, simply present. The way certain things are simply present in a person's life. Nobody watching knew because Ed Sullivan had decided at some point so early in his career that the decision itself had become invisible, that America was going to get the show and he was going to keep everything else. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you what he kept, not to diminish what he gave, because what he gave was extraordinary and shaped American culture in ways that are still reverberating today, but because the story of what Ed Sullivan hid, and what it cost him to hide it, and what it did to the people closest to him, and what it means that he maintained the distance between the public man and the private one with such complete consistency for 40 years, is one of the most human stories in the history of American television. It is a story about a man who created a stage for everyone else and never once, in 40 years, stepped onto it himself. So come with me. We are going back to the beginning. We are going to New York City, to the neighborhood of Harlem in the year 1901, where a man named Peter Arthur Sullivan and his wife, Helen Barbara, Kelly Sullivan, were raising their children in the particular way of Irish Catholic families in New York at the turn of the century, with faith and discipline and the unspoken but absolute understanding that life required something from you, that you did not simply receive the days but were expected to contribute to them in ways that were visible and measurable and respected by the community around you. Edward Vincent Sullivan was born on the 28th of September, 1901. He was the third of 5 children. The family lived in Harlem, which in 1901 was not the neighborhood it would later become, but was instead a middle-class neighborhood of Irish and Jewish and Italian families, working people who had come to New York from somewhere else and were building the particular kind of New York life that is built on the bedrock of work and church, and the block you live on and the people who live on it with you. Peter Sullivan worked for the United States Customs Service. He was, by the accounts of people who remembered him, a serious man, not cold, not unkind, but serious in the way of men of his generation who understood that seriousness was a form of respect for the difficulty of the world. He expected his children to be serious too. He expected them to work hard and behave correctly and bring credit to the family name, which was an Irish name in New York in 1901, and which carried its own particular freight of history and expectation and the long shadow of a community that had fought for its place in this city and was not inclined to squander what had been won. Ed Sullivan grew up in Port Chester, New York, to which the family moved when he was a child. Port Chester was smaller than New York, more contained, a town where everyone knew everyone and the social geography was clear and the expectations were specific. He was a good athlete, baseball and football, both. He was not, by most accounts of his school years, a particularly distinguished student in the academic sense. But he had something that school grades do not measure and that the people around him noticed even then. He had an instinct for people, an ability to read a room, to understand what an audience wanted, to feel the temperature of a gathering and respond to it with something that felt to the people in the gathering like genuine attention to them specifically. This is a gift that is very hard to teach and very easy to waste. Ed Sullivan did not waste it. He began his career in journalism. Sports journalism first, in the early 1920s, writing for newspapers in New York about the sports that New York cared about, boxing and baseball and football, and the specific texture of New York sports culture, which is its own thing distinct from sports culture anywhere else in the country. He was good at it. He had the voice for it, the direct, unadorned New York Irish voice that tells you what happened without unnecessary decoration and trusts you to understand why it matters. He moved to the New York Graphic and then to the New York Daily News, where he became a Broadway columnist in 1931, and where the career that would eventually become the television show began to take its real shape. The column was called Little Old New York, and it ran for decades, and it was, by the standards of Broadway columns of its era, enormously influential. Sullivan knew everyone. He went everywhere. He understood the entertainment industry not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who moved through it daily, who had relationships with the performers and the producers and the club owners and the agents and all the people who made the machinery run. And he had opinions, strong ones, consistently held, expressed without apology. He championed performers he believed in before they were famous. He attacked people he thought were frauds or cowards with the particular directness of a New York Irish columnist who has decided that diplomatic dishonesty is its own form of corruption. He made enemies. He made a great many enemies over the years. He also made friends, and the friends he made tended to be loyal in the way that people are loyal to someone who has championed them when nobody else would. He married Sylvia Weinstein in 1930. This is the fact in Ed Sullivan's biography that when you sit with it long enough, tells you more about who he was than almost anything else. Sylvia Weinstein was the daughter of a Jewish family. Ed Sullivan was the son of Irish Catholic parents. In New York, in 1930, this was not a small thing. The two communities existed side by side in the city, had been existing side by side for decades, and the side by side had produced a great deal of mutual respect and genuine friendship, and, in this case, love. But it had not produced, in most cases, marriage. Marriage was where the communities tended to hold their lines. Ed Sullivan crossed the line. He crossed it in 1930, in New York, and he did it without apparent hesitation and without making it a public statement or a demonstration of anything. He married Sylvia because he loved her, and the community he came from could accept that or not accept it, and he was going to go ahead regardless. They had one child, a daughter named Betty, born in 1932. The family that resulted from the marriage of Ed Sullivan and Sylvia Weinstein was, by the account of everyone who observed it from the outside and by the account of their daughter in later years, a genuinely loving family. Complicated in the ways that most families are complicated, held together through years of difficulty by the particular quality of Sylvia's patience and intelligence, and the genuine depth of her attachment to a man who was not, by the account of anyone who knew him, easy to be attached to. Because here is the thing about Ed Sullivan that the 40 million people watching on Sunday nights did not know and could not have guessed from the man on the screen. He was, in private, a man of extraordinary difficulty. The drinking was part of it, but only part of it. He drank heavily throughout his adult life, not in the spectacular, self-destructive way of some public figures, not in a way that regularly impaired his professional functioning, but consistently and seriously, in the way of a man who has found that a certain amount of alcohol makes the interior life more manageable, and has organized his habits around that discovery. The people who worked with him knew about it. The performers who came through the show knew about it. It was not precisely a secret in the sense that the people in his professional world were aware of it. But it was also not discussed publicly, because in the world of American entertainment in the 1950s and 1960s, a man's drinking was understood to be his own business as long as it did not visibly impair the product. And Ed Sullivan's drinking did not visibly impair the product. What it impaired was the people around him. Sylvia, above all. Sylvia, who was the person in his life who absorbed the version of him that the cameras never saw. The rages that were not directed at anyone specific, but that filled rooms and made the air difficult to breathe. The dark periods that lasted days, the moods that descended without warning and lifted without explanation. The man who could be, in the worst moments, genuinely frightening to be near. She stayed. She stayed for 53 years, until his death. She stayed not out of passivity or resignation, but out of something that is harder to name and easier to dismiss than it deserves. A genuine and complicated love for a man whose public face was a simplified version of a person who was, in private, far more interesting and far more painful than the television host. She understood him in ways that the public could not understand him because the public only ever had the Sunday night version. The man in the tuxedo with the stilted manner and the odd, stiff quality of presence that became, over the years, a kind of trademark. The stiffness was real. It was not an affectation, not a character that had been developed for television. It was how he actually was. A man who was, in front of cameras and audiences, genuinely and visibly uncomfortable in his own skin. Uncomfortable in a way that never went away, no matter how many years he spent in front of cameras and audiences. He was not a natural performer. He was not relaxed. He was not the kind of television presence that made the medium look easy. He was, instead, something that turned out to be rarer and more valuable. He was absolutely, unmistakably real. You could feel, watching him, that the stiffness and the discomfort were not performed. They were him, exactly him. A man who was genuinely ill at ease in the spotlight he had placed himself in, and who was going to stand in it anyway because the show required it. And Ed Sullivan did not walk away from what the show required. This quality, the quality of a man who is visibly and genuinely uncomfortable and who is going to proceed regardless, communicated something to American audiences that 40 years of television hosting cannot entirely explain. It communicated, in some unspoken way, sincerity. You could not watch Ed Sullivan on Sunday night and feel that you were being sold something, because the man selling it was too obviously not a salesman. He was too obviously himself, even if the self he was showing you was a carefully edited version of the larger and more complicated self that existed offstage. The show began in 1948 on a Sunday night in June, and it ran for 23 years until 1971. In those 23 years, it presented to the American public a portrait of American entertainment that was, in its breadth and its ambition, and its genuine commitment to the idea that the audience deserved the best that was available, without parallel. He put Elvis Presley on television when Elvis Presley was considered by a significant portion of the country to be a dangerous influence on the young. He put the Beatles on television in February of 1964 and delivered, in doing so, one of the most watched broadcasts in the history of the medium to that point. He put comedians and opera singers and acrobats and plate spinners and trained animals and classical musicians and Broadway stars and folk singers and dancers and magicians on the same stage in the same hour week after week, with a confidence in the eclecticism of his own taste that never wavered even when critics questioned it. He had decided, at some point early in the show's run, that his job was to reflect the full range of what American entertainment was and could be, and that any limitation on that range was a failure of nerve that he was not interested in. This conviction was sincere, and it was also, in retrospect, revolutionary, because it produced a show that did something no other television program of its era attempted. It treated its audience as a collection of individuals with different tastes and different backgrounds and different ideas about what was worth an hour of their Sunday night. And it tried to give every one of those individuals something that was specifically for them. The discipline required to sustain that for 23 years is staggering. The show aired every Sunday night without significant break for 23 years. That is more than 1,000 broadcasts. Each one required booking and producing and rehearsing and the particular management of an enormous number of egos and talents and technical requirements that the making of live television demands. Each one required Ed Sullivan to walk out onto that stage in front of a studio audience and 40 million people at home and be, for an hour, the calm and confident center of a complicated live production. And each one was preceded by the moment that the photograph captures, the moment in the wings, alone with whatever he was alone with, before the signal came and the performance began. He had a quality that the performers who appeared on the show remembered consistently and specifically. He was, despite the public reputation for stiffness and difficulty, extraordinarily generous to the people he was presenting. He worked the room before the show, visiting every dressing room, checking in on the performers, making sure that the people who were about to go in front of 40 million people felt that the host of the show was on their side. He did this not because it was professionally strategic, but because he understood from his years of covering entertainment as a journalist what it felt like to be the person who had to deliver. And he had a genuine and specific compassion for that experience. He had a particular relationship with black performers that was, for its time and context, genuinely unusual and worth understanding clearly. Sullivan had been booking black performers on his show from the very beginning, at a time when American television was largely and casually segregated in its programming. He booked Bo Diddley and Louis Armstrong and Pearl Bailey and Nat King Cole and Count Basie and many others, not as an act of deliberate integration, but because he had grown up in New York, had worked in New York entertainment for decades, and his experience of what good performance looked like was shaped by the full range of what New York had to offer, which included, prominently and centrally, the extraordinary contributions of black artists to American popular culture. He received mail about this. He received a great deal of mail from people who did not want to see black performers on their television sets on Sunday nights. He did not respond to the mail by changing his booking practices. He responded by continuing to book whoever he believed deserved to be booked, and by occasionally, in his column and in interviews, saying plainly and without elaboration that he intended to go on doing this regardless of what anyone thought about it. This was not, in 1950, a cost-free position. He took the criticism and he absorbed the cancellations from certain markets, and he continued. This was, for the time and context, a form of courage that tends to be invisible in retrospect, because it is so clearly the correct thing to have done, but that was not easy or automatic or without professional consequence at the time. He had a similar quality in his relationship to comedy. He booked comedians who were considered difficult or dangerous by the standards of network television in the 1950s, comedians who pushed at the edges of what was considered acceptable material, comedians who had political points of view that made advertisers nervous. Not always, not consistently enough that it can be called a policy, but often enough that the performers who came through the show remembered him as someone who who had given them a platform when other platforms were closed. He had a particular and well-documented relationship with Jackie Mason that turned, in 1964, into one of the most public feuds in the history of the show, when Sullivan believed, during a live broadcast, that Mason had made an obscene gesture at him on camera. Mason denied it. The dispute escalated into lawsuits and counter-lawsuits and a public argument that went on for years. Sullivan, by the account of most observers, was wrong about what he had seen. He was also, by every account, completely certain that he was right, and the certainty was genuine, not performed. This quality, the absolute impervious certainty of a man who has decided he knows what he saw and is not going to be argued out of it, was characteristic of him in private as well as in public, and was one of the things that made living and working with him consistently difficult. He was not, by the account of the people who knew him best, a man who was easy to tell he was wrong. He was not a man who received correction or criticism with any of the grace that he showed to the performers on his stage. He was, in the private version of himself, a man with a powerful need to be right that expressed itself in ways that were sometimes bewildering and sometimes frightening and sometimes, in the longer view, simply exhausting. Sylvia managed this. She had been managing it since 1930. She had developed, over decades, an ability to navigate the moods and the certainties and the rages and the dark periods with a combination of patience and strategic gentleness that the people who observed it close up found extraordinary. She did not capitulate. She was not passive. She was, by every account, a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine strength of character. But she had also made a decision, at some point in the long arc of the marriage, that the man she had married required a specific kind of management that she was capable of providing, and that providing it was something she chose to do, not something that was done to her. Their daughter Betty grew up watching this. She grew up watching her father from a careful distance and watching her mother from close range. And she drew her own conclusions about what the marriage meant and what it required and what it produced. And she kept those conclusions largely to herself, which was perhaps the most Sullivan-like thing she ever did. Betty married Bob Precht in 1952. Bob Precht became, over the years, one of the producers of The Ed Sullivan Show, a fact that gives the family structure of the enterprise a quality that is both touching and slightly vertiginous. The image of a man who built his professional world so completely around himself that even his son-in-law became part of the architecture. Precht was, by all accounts, a steady and capable producer who understood the show and understood his father-in-law and had made his own peace with both. He outlasted the show, and he outlasted Ed Sullivan, and he was, in the years after Sullivan's death, one of the primary guardians of the Sullivan legacy. Ed Sullivan's health began to decline in the late 1960s. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in the early 1970s, and the cancer progressed with the speed that such diagnoses often progressed at, in an era before the treatments that now exist had been developed. He kept working as long as he could. The show had ended in 1971, canceled by CBS after 23 years in a decision that was handled with a clumsiness that hurt him more than the cancellation itself. He was told about it, by most accounts, in a way that did not honor what he had given the network for 2 decades, and the hurt was real, and he did not hide it. He died on October the 13th, 1974. He was 72 years old. Sylvia was with him, Betty was with him, the private man and the public man arrived at the same end. In the same room, the distance between them finally closed by the thing that closes all distances. The tributes that followed were genuine, and they were also, inevitably, the tributes to the public man, to the host, the impresario, the man in the tuxedo who had stood on that stage for 23 years and given America the Sunday night it needed. They were tributes to what he had done, and what he had done was enormous and real and worthy of the tributes. But Sylvia, who had been there for the private man, said almost nothing. She had said almost nothing about the private man for 50 years. She saw no reason to change that now. She thanked the people who sent condolences. She received the visitors. She kept herself, as she had always kept herself, behind the line that separated the public understanding of Ed Sullivan from the private reality of him. And she maintained that line with the same quiet, absolute consistency with which he had maintained his own. She lived until 1973. She preceded him in death by about a year, actually, dying of complications from a fall. And in all the years of the marriage, and all the years of the public life, and all the years of the show, and all the interviews, and all the columns, and all the letters, and all the opportunities that presented themselves to say something about the real Ed Sullivan, the one in the wings with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, she said almost nothing that was not already known. She kept what she knew. She kept it the way he kept what he knew, which is to say, absolutely and without apology, and until the keeping was no longer possible. Now I want to sit with you for a moment, my friend, because I think there is something here that is worth more than the chronology and the facts, worth more even than the specific things that Ed Sullivan hid, which I have tried to describe honestly without claiming to know more certainly than can be known. What I want to sit with is the question of why a man who had the entire apparatus of American popular culture at his disposal, who could, at any moment, have turned the camera on himself and spoken about whatever he chose to speak about, who had the platform and the audience and the attention, why a man like that would choose consistently and for decades not to, because he could have. That is the thing that is easy to forget. He could have made himself the subject. He could have spoken about his marriage, his drinking, his moods, his faith, his fear, his loneliness in the specific way that is the loneliness of a man who is surrounded by people and known by none of them. He could have done what some performers do, which is to use the platform the audience has given them to give the audience, in return, a version of their inner life that feels like intimacy and is actually just a different kind of performance. He did not do this. He used the platform for everyone else. He used it for Elvis and the Beatles and Louis Armstrong and Pearl Bailey and Senor Wences and the acrobats and the plate spinners and the opera singers and the comedians and the dancers and the trained animals. He used it for the full, extravagant, democratic, slightly chaotic range of what American entertainment could be when someone with taste and nerve and genuine conviction about what an audience deserved was the one making the decisions. And, in doing so, he hid himself so completely behind the show that most of America, watching for 23 years, never quite registered that there was a self to hide. He became, in the perception of the public, the frame rather than the painting, the structure that held everything else in place, the presence that made sense of the presentations without itself requiring to be understood. This was, I think, deliberate, not cynically deliberate, not the calculated self-effacement of a man who wants to be seen not seeing himself. Genuinely deliberate, the decision of a man who understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in his medium at his time, that the point of the stage is not the person who announces the acts, but the acts themselves. That the host who makes himself the show has confused his role in a way that is ultimately a disservice to everyone, to the performers who deserve the attention, and to the audience who came for the performances and not for the man who introduces them. He gave the stage to everyone else, and he kept what was his in the place where what is ours belongs, which is inside, in the private life that no audience has a right to, in the room that the cameras cannot enter. The depression was there. He spoke about it very rarely, in terms that were oblique enough to be almost deniable. References to dark periods, to times when the work was the only thing that kept him moving forward. The drinking was there. The rages were there. The marriage was there, complicated and real, and sustained by a woman who deserved more credit than she ever received, and who would have been the first to say that credit was not what she was after. All of it was there, in the wings, with him, every Sunday night for 23 years. All of it was standing right next to him in that photograph that nobody has seen. In the 30 seconds before the signal came, and he walked out and became for an hour the version of himself that America knew. And then he walked out, and he smiled, and he said the words that opened the show, the words that became, over the years, one of the most recognizable signatures in the history of American broadcasting. The words that carried in them, if you knew where to listen, the entire compressed weight of everything he was not saying about himself. He said, "We have a really big show." He always said it slightly wrong. The rhythm was slightly off, the emphasis slightly misplaced, the delivery slightly stiffer than anyone who practiced it would have made it. He said it exactly the way a man says something when he is not acting, but simply saying what he means. And what he means is, I have built something for you. Something large and varied and worth your time. Something that I believe in, even if I will never entirely tell you why. Every Sunday night for 23 years, we have a really big show. He did. He really did. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see a clip, Elvis on the Sullivan stage, or the Beatles, or any of the 1,000 acts that passed through that theater in those 23 years, look for just a moment at the man standing at the side of the stage, the man who is watching what he built, with an expression that is not quite pride and not quite satisfaction and not quite peace, but something that contains all of those things and something else too, something that has no clean name. You are looking at a man who gave 40 million people every Sunday night everything they needed and kept what was his, exactly where he kept it, all the way to the end,